So I've talked a lot in this House about the different areas of expertise that we have as members of Parliament, that we come here with different backgrounds. Some of us are experts in academic issues, technical issues. Some of us are just experts in what it's like to come from our regions. And so we're very much like Canada in that way. And like Canadians, we all have these different backgrounds. Now, my background is not agriculture, and so this bill has been a real learning experience for me, and I wanted to share with the House where my learning experience on this bill actually started, because I'll be honest, this bill was not on my radar when it was first tabled. And I mean, look at the fact that I'm a member of Parliament for Halifax, an urban centre. There are a few fishing villages in my riding, but I really don't represent any agricultural areas. But I talk often in this House about how important it is for us to talk to constituents, to tap into their expertise, but also to hear about their hopes or their dreams, or to hear about their fears about different pieces of legislation. And that's exactly what happened to me when this bill came up. I looked in my calendar one day and saw that members of the Food Action Committee, which is a committee of the Ecology Action Centre, they had actually scheduled a meeting with me to talk about C-18. And I'm not one to even remember bill numbers very quickly, so I had to look it up. And I realized, well, it made sense that the Food Action Committee wanted to talk to me about this bill. It's called an Act to Amend Certain Acts Relating to Agriculture and Agri-Food. But I wondered why they wanted to talk to me about it. And I immediately contacted my friend and colleague, the member for Welland. He is our agriculture critic, as you know, and he forwarded me a lot of materials about what it is that C-18 sought to do or purports to do. And he walked me through what some of the key issues were for him as our critic, but also very likely for the Food Action Committee. So I went ahead with this meeting and met with Jonathan Cornelson and Mary Ellen Sullivan. And it was great. It was your typical sort of NDP meeting, or sorry, not NDP, MP meeting. Yeah, that was a Freudian slip. Yeah, I'm getting heckled now. It was a typical MP meeting where folks will say, look, these are the issues that we have with this bill. What's the NDP? That's where I meant to say that. What's the NDP's position on this? And they actually presented me with a petition titled The Right to Save Seeds. And this had 145 signatures on behalf of the Food Action Committee. And they explained to me that they were out. A friend of theirs had 3 pages of these petitions, and he couldn't keep up. He ran out of the 3 pages so quickly. He was down at a grocery store, and people were really passionate about this, right in downtown Halifax. And the petition that they presented me with addresses the Agricultural Growth Act portion of Bill C-18, and it has raised serious concerns amongst farmers and consumers. They put together the text of the petition with the help of the National Farmers Union website. Now, before I get to the content of the meeting or the content of the bill, I want to read you something from a blog that Mary Ellen Sullivan contributes to called Adventures in Local Food. I want to read it because if there's any message that I have tried to communicate during my time as a member of Parliament, it's that politicians are just members of our communities. We're not experts. We rely on the expertise of our communities. We want to talk to people and have our constituents help shape our views on policy and legislation, even if we're going to disagree in the end. It's so important to be in touch, and I'm always thankful when people do that. So on this blog, Adventures in Local Food, Ms. Sullivan wrote about our meeting, and she wrote, "Our meeting was a relaxed exchange of information, questions, and discussion with our MP, advising us of the position of the NDP and the workings of the political process. Because we received more than 25 signatures, she can present our petition in Parliament. It was a great learning and rewarding experience for Jonathan and me. She instilled confidence in us that our grassroots actions, such as petitions, demonstrations, and meeting with your MP, do have an impact. Politicians do take note of these actions. I found that the NFU website provided excellent education and action resources, including background information on C-18 and other issues. Just use the search box for issues you're interested in. It gives advocacy suggestions, including how to meet with your MP and information sheets that can be given to them. NFU works in collaboration with such organizations as the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, CBAN, on issues affecting farmers and consumers. Meeting with our MP was a great education for us and gave us confidence to continue to take food action. I was delighted to have Jonathan join me, a fledgling Food Action Committee member with 2 meetings under his belt, a background in biology, experience working on a farm in BC, and lots of knowledge and passion. Glad he decided to see what's going on in Nova Scotia. We hope you'll be inspired to meet with your MP too. Learn about the issues and relax. Our MPs are working for us. End of her blog post. And that's pretty inspiring. I'm really glad that Mary Ellen Sullivan took the time to actually lay out, look, this isn't difficult. We can meet with our MPs. They are working for us. Let's sit down. You can relax. She actually says relax. And I thought that was a great message. So, on to the content. As you heard from Ms. Sullivan, we did talk about the issues in this bill, including an issue that was very important to them, and this was probably the main issue that they wanted to communicate to me, and that's the ability to save seeds. You heard my colleague from Timmins James Bay actually go into this quite a bit. So when people come and meet with you, they do want to explain their perspective on different issues, but they also want to hear what your perspective is, and they want to know what your party will do. Are you going to support this bill? Are you going to vote against it? What are people saying about it? And so they asked me, what's your position? And I explained to them, as I'll explain to the House now, that this bill is problematic. It is an omnibus piece of legislation, another omnibus piece of legislation, that makes changes to 9 different pieces of legislation. Now, looking at them and breaking down what these changes are, and they are extensive, there are some parts of this bill that we do support. There are other parts that we, on their face, oppose and do find problematic. So what do you do when you're faced with this kind of situation? What do you do when you like some parts but think that other parts will actually do damage? Well, I do think that our critic, the member for Welland, and his deputy critic, the member from Berthier-Masquinongé, Masquinongé, thank you, Berthier-Masquinongé, I think that they've put a lot of thought into this. They've consulted with stakeholders, and they've done an excellent job of dissecting all the points in this bill to bring them to a balanced conclusion. My colleague from Malpec actually posed a question to my colleague from Timmins James Bay and said, well, what is the solution here? I wrote down a little bit of what he said. He has great expertise in this area. He said, we're not sure where we can go with farmers' privilege. How do we balance that? How do we figure out farmers' rights versus farmers' privilege here? And it's a great question to ask. We don't always have all those answers when we're here at second reading, just fleshing out the ideas of a bill. It's so important that we bring this to committee and actually study and listen to experts and maybe try and come up with those solutions. I don't have some of the solutions before me right now, but I'm eager to hear from my colleagues what some of those solutions might be. And I told Ms. Sullivan and Mr. Cornelson that I was prepared to support the bill at second reading. And that at committee, we do plan to work on making the problematic aspects of this bill better, and we plan to try and fix the problems. I have to admit, I am not overly optimistic that the Conservatives will listen to our proposal, but I refuse to be cynical about this and just give in. I do think that we have to try. So what are the problematic aspects of this bill? I have received a number of postcards from constituents speaking out against the bill. But in particular, I've received a lot of postcards. There's a postcard campaign on the issues of farmers' privilege. And the postcard on the front says, "Save our seeds, stop Bill C-18. Farmers' age-old practices of saving, reusing, exchanging, and selling seed are in jeopardy." The postcard has some really compelling language in it. It says that the bill that's before the House of Commons would allow the biggest seed companies in the world to exercise almost total control over seed in Canada. These companies would also be able to charge royalties on a farmer's entire crop. The bill includes power to make regulations that would quickly undo or severely limit the so-called farmer's privilege to save seed. This means Canadian farmers would pay giant corporations hundreds of millions each year for the right to grow a crop. Canadians do not want multinational seed and chemical companies like Bayer, Monsanto, DuPont, Dow, and Syngenta to control our seed and ultimately our food system. So I'm asking you as my democratically elected representative to safeguard Canadian farmers' rights to save, reuse, exchange, and sell seed by taking all actions necessary to stop Bill C-18. So that's pretty passionate. They're not asking for a rewrite here. They're saying to stop. And I want to thank some of my constituents who have reached out to me on this, including Tessa Gold-Smith, Jim Guild, Herb and Ruth Gamberg, Steve Burns, Aaron Isis, Mark McKenna, Josh Smith, Elizabeth Gold, and Peter Gravel. So these are all folks who have signed on to this, saying that we should actually stop C-18. I sympathize with their demand to stop this bill, even though I am going to support it at second reading. This is one of these balancing acts that we have to play, Mr. Speaker, from time to time. And when I sat down with Jonathan and Mary Ellen and said, look, there are some aspects of this bill that we would support, they asked me, well, which parts? And I do believe that there are some pieces of this bill, like putting stronger controls for products that are being imported or exported. I do think that there's strengthening of record-keeping requirements, whether it's for plants or for feed or for fertilizer. And there are some safety measures in there to prevent risks to human, animal, environmental health. I think one big part that everybody could support was prohibiting the sale of products that are subject of a recall order from the CFIA. I mean, that's a great step towards strengthening our food safety system, and actually makes me wonder why that hasn't been there all along. So it is a balancing act to figure it out, so we will try and get it to committee. I do agree with the constituents of mine who've written to me in this postcard campaign about the farmers' privilege piece. I've got 2 more letters, actually, that I received from some constituents about this issue. One's from Margaret Murray, who said to me, no doubt you've done some investigation on Bill C-18. I'm wondering what the NDP position is on this important issue. Multinationals like Monsanto must be curtailed in their attempts to own what ought to be the public domain. Taking a renewable, common resource and turning it into a non-renewable, patented commodity is simply wrong. So that was Margaret Murray. I've also heard from Cynthia O'Connell, who wrote to me asking me to oppose C-18 as it will harm organic farmers on whom she depends for organic food. So even though this bill is ostensibly about agriculture, it really does impact consumers, including consumers in urban centres like Halifax, where I represent. And so it is capturing the hearts and minds of people. They are writing into me. And like I said, there is a balance that has to be done here. There are benefits of the changes found, some benefits. I need to use a qualifier. There are some benefits of the changes found in this bill, like enhancing public accessibility and transparency when it comes to plant breeding. And, for example, protecting researchers from infringement of plant breeders' rights. But the issue of farmers' privilege is significant. And I will say, Mr. Speaker, that is the #1 issue that people have written to me about. It has been about farmers' privilege. So let's get to farmers' privilege and what the NDP would see as very problematic. Farmers' privilege does not include the stocking of propagating material for any use. So, what does that mean? Even if farmers are able to save seed for the purpose of reproduction, it looks like they may have to pay to store it, which would effectively negate that privilege. And so earlier, Mr. Speaker, when I said that we don't necessarily have all the answers when we come here at second reading and debate this bill, I'm very clear when I said it looks like they're going to have to pay to store it. I would want to explore this issue, find out from the minister if that's actually the intention. If it's not the intention, then maybe that can be fixed with simple wording change. The farmer's privilege also doesn't extend to the sale of harvested material. So this means that farmers will likely still be required to pay for the sale of the crops grown from farm-saved seed. It also means that plant breeders could potentially generate revenue on a farmer's entire production rather than just on the seed purchased to grow the crop. And this could have significant impacts on the profit margins of farmers. Now, some farmers say that paying a royalty base on what they produce instead of on the seed that they buy actually reduces their risk. If they harvest a poor crop, they pay less with an endpoint royalty compared to paying upfront from when they buy seed. So this, I mean, even in what I'm presenting to you right now, Mr. Speaker, there's some, I'm a little bit unsure. So this is something that we would need to explore further as well. This bill, C-18, includes amendments that allow the CFIA to make changes through regulation, not through legislation, that's an important distinction, to the farmer's privilege. This means that the government could significantly hinder these rights at any time without parliamentary oversight. Not a lot of people understand the difference between regulation and legislation. Legislation would have to come here before the House. We would debate it. We would vote on it. There's a process. Regulation is just an order in council. What does that mean? Effectively, what it means is the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, has written something down and given notice, and it's not democratic, right? It is an interpretation of what the legislation is, and who knows where that comes from. In theory, it's governor and council, but in reality, I doubt that that's the case. So there's no parliamentary oversight, and these rights could be changed at any time. At least that's my reading of it. Allowing for farm-saved seeds is an optional exemption under UPOV 91. This is the International Union for Protection of New Varieties of Plants that we signed in 1991. And that means that Canada could disallow farm-saved seed and still fulfill its international obligations under the agreement. While Bill C-18 goes so far as to define what's meant by a document, so that's good, there's some detail there, it doesn't actually give a definition of farmer. That's problematic. This has some pretty important implications for the enforcement of farmers' privilege. I mean, it goes to the root of the issue here, especially given that C-18 allows the government to make significant changes to the farmers' privilege provisions through regulation. There we are again. So we can actually have changes made without any parliamentary oversight through regulation, and there's no definition of what a farmer is. Given the government's recent changes in Bill C-4, that limited farm loss deductions to people whose primary income is from farming, this is an area where more clarity is needed. Do I count as a farmer if I am participating in a community garden in downtown Halifax? I'm not sure. In order to prevent the privatization of existing varieties, we have to ensure a variety registration system that ensures that new crop varieties are as good or better than existing ones. We also have to ensure that farmers will continue to have access to existing cereal varieties that were developed by public plant breeders. I'll finish up with how much time do I have left, Mr. Speaker? Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll finish up with a couple other concerns about the potential legal burden for producers. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture has called for protections for producers from claims of patent infringement with respect to natural or accidental spreading of patented plant genetic material, but they're not included in C-18. And given that the expansion of breeders' rights under C-18 is so significant, it's likely that farmers are going to face increased and expensive litigation. There's no provision in this bill to ensure that legal fees don't impede farmers' defense in these cases. So that is the overview of what it is that my constituents in downtown Halifax have written to me about. There are other issues in this bill, which I'm sure you'll hear about from other members of Parliament, but that's the big one for the folks that I represent. And while I will be supporting this at second reading, as I have pointed out, this is something we have to watch closely. This is something we really have to push to change, to make amendments to this bill, to protect farmers, and I look forward to being able to do that at committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased that the Democrats haven't adjourned the House or attempted to adjourn the House. That's a positive thing. Next thing, of course, is that we have a good piece of legislation. When I say good, I should qualify it. Mr. Speaker, this is legislation that actually attempts to make changes to 9 other pieces of legislation. And the government's track record in terms of making changes to legislation that impacts our farmers is not very encouraging. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you that there are many other things in which the government could have been doing to work with a number of the changes that they're putting into place through Bill C-18. And the member highlights certain areas. There are some aspects of the legislation that are positive and I think would receive a fairly decent support from our stakeholders, in particular our farmers, and we within the Liberal Party are very grateful for that. But there are other aspects that are not. And the concern has got to be, Mr. Speaker, that we have yet again this large bill that's coming before us, which is making changes to several pieces of legislation. My question to the member is, would she not agree that it would have been far better off had the government done its homework and work with our different communities, our different stakeholders, to come up with what should have been several pieces of legislation, and this way we would have had probably better and more easier passage on some of the more positive aspects of Bill C-18.
The honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. I also thank him for qualifying the word good, because when he stood up and said this is a good piece of legislation, I wondered what was going on, but he did qualify good. Yeah, there are some good pieces here, but there are some problematic pieces. You know what I'm holding in my hand? I'm not holding it as a prop. These are just my notes. But these are some notes that my colleague from Welland has put together for folks like me where this isn't our area of expertise. These notes are really quite incredible because it talks about each bill that's being amended. As you heard, there are 9 different bills. This is omnibus legislation. And so we have to look at it that way. Okay, so we're doing an amendment to the Feeds Act, the Fertilizers Act, the Seed Act, and the Health of Animals Act, and the Plant Protection Act. Here's what's good about it. Here's what's problematic about it. There's amendments to the Agricultural Marketing Programs Act and the Advanced Payment Program. Here's what's positive about it. Here's what's concerning about it. This is too much, Mr. Speaker. You know, I go back to 2012 where we had the omnibus budget bill. Oh, wait, no, we had 2 omnibus budget bills. And I can't actually remember if it was the first one or the second one, but in there, it was the first one, touched over 70 pieces of legislation, completely rewrote our environmental legislation, and there were changes to the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. Do you know what that is? That is the law that governs how we, if we can sell or trade or what we do with eggs, with sperm. This act was changed, and I searched Hansard to see who debated it. I raised it once. I just said, Assisted Human Reproduction Act is included. And my colleague from Hamilton, one of the Hamiltons, also raised it. But it was just a mention. This is a fun, like, whether or not women can be surrogate mothers, and the law was changed, and it was buried in omnibus legislation. God willing, there's no changes to our reproduction rights in this bill, but who knows? We'll see.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci beaucoup à mon honorable collègue pour son excellent discours. Et pour continuer sur la même ligne de pensée, on se questionne beaucoup sur pourquoi le gouvernement conservateur a fait différentes petites modifications, plusieurs amendements à plusieurs projets de loi, sans nécessairement que le gouvernement vienne nous convaincre que ces changements-là sont, 1, nécessaires, et 2, sont dans l'intérêt des Canadiens. Et les Canadiens aujourd'hui, en leur nom qu'on parle aujourd'hui, c'est beaucoup les agriculteurs. Et j'aimerais demander à ma collègue, qu'est-ce qu'elle pense du fait que dans le projet de loi C-18, on va définir la notion de document, mais qu'on ne définit pas le terme agriculteur. Ça, c'est important parce que ça a d'importants effets sur l'application du privilège accordé aux agriculteurs. Donc, est-ce qu'elle croit que justement que c'est raisonnable que le gouvernement modifie justement une définition, mais ne définit pas le terme agriculteur? Et puis justement, comme on parle du privilège d'agriculteur qui est tellement important dans ce projet de loi-là, moi, ma crainte personnellement, c'est que ça vienne créer des failles dans le système.
The honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question, and I also thank him for the advocacy that he does on behalf of his constituents here in the House. He's here talking about this bill. He's always here raising issues that impact his constituents, and I think he should be commended for it. What I'll say to him is, don't take my word for it. Take some of the experts who are out there. For example, Ann Slater. She is first vice president of the National Farmers Union and an Ontario farmer. And she argues that the government's changes to plant breeders' rights will turn the customary practice of farmers saving and reusing seeds as part of normal farm activity into privilege, and that privilege could easily be revoked in the future. Dominique Bernier from Amis de la Terre de Québec. She says this bill significantly weakens farmers' ancestral rights by forcing them to pay allowances to agro-industry giants on the entirety of their harvest. However, the marketing of new crop varieties by the big breeders rests on a world's heritage, the patient selection over 1,000 years of crops by the succeeding generations of farmers. So there are people raising problems with the bill who have expertise, but to get back, he mentioned the omnibus nature of this bill, to get back to that, there are people saying positive things about the bill. But it's not a dispute, right? It's not, I think this policy X is good, I think this policy X is bad. It's that there are so many X, Ys, and Zs in one piece of legislation that there are, I was going to say competing points of view, but that's not it at all. People are saying, I want X, but we don't want Y. It's really quite amazing when there are this many pieces of legislation that are being touched. I really think that something needs to be done to stop this kind of ramming through of so many changes.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member from Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will say I really appreciate the member for Halifax on her feet on this bill. It's good to see people who have urban ridings talk about their concerns, and I think we all agree it needs to go to a committee and be discussed. And my question really relates to her in terms of, I guess, mainly her constituents' opinion on this. Where would those people who buy the products, the food products that farmers produce, where would they rather they come from to a certain extent? And I think this bill, as many of the bills this government has put in this House, has really transferred a lot of control away from primary producers and to the corporate sector. I mean, the changes to the Canadian Wheat Board, really, we've seen the results of that this winter, where farmers used to receive about 87% of the export price. Now they're receiving about 48% of the export price. So the corporate sector is gaining there. But I'd point out to the member that in 2002, Canada ratified the United Nations International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and Canada was signatory to that. And in that agreement, we agreed, or the agreement agrees, not to limit any rights that farmers have to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-saved seed, propagating material, subject to national law that is appropriate. And so my question to the member mainly is, because she does represent a lot of urban constituents, what's their view? Where would they rather see their produce come? Who would they like to see in control of that produce? Family farmers or the big corporations like Monsanto?
The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Malpeque for that question. And I'm glad he pointed out I am from an urban riding, and so we are the consumers, right? And you wouldn't think that we're necessarily connected to the land, but in fact we are quite connected to the land. And you can see that in the incredible popularity of our farmers market, the Halifax Seaport Market. You can see that with the incredible popularity of a store called Local Source that only sells local products. If you go to the farmers market in Halifax, you're not going to find oranges. It is farmers, it is producers, it is meat mongers, it is fishermen, and they're there selling their products that are local. Absolutely, without a doubt, my constituents want to see those rights and privileges kept with the local, I'm getting the wrap up, with the local family farm. It's incredibly important to us as urban consumers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de débat.